Hi, I'm Phil Harbottle, and this is my 66th video discussing British science fiction. In earlier videos, I've already told how I've been a close follower of Garth, the Garth comic strip in the Daily Mirror, since childhood. Collecting was in my DNA, and I'd actually begun clipping and saving the serialised stories in 1950 when the strip had entered a distinctly science-fictional streak. By the early 1970s, I was so enthused with the strip that I began a worldwide correspondence with other Garth enthusiasts, whereby I exchanged clippings and photocopies with other collectors all over the world, intent on building up a complete collection of all the Garth stories since its beginning in 1943. I just had to have every Garth story to date. With no internet then in existence, this was one hell of a task, requiring infinite patience and enthusiasm. But somehow I eventually managed it. Along the way, I discovered that Garth stories had been reprinted in comic book form all over the world, especially in Australia. See some Australian titles here. And also in New Zealand. Those two there are from New Zealand. And there were myriad foreign language translations in France. See 3 French ones there. These are from Portugal. That's Portugal. That one's Spain. Portugal, Spain. You see more French over there. All of these foreign editions I avidly collected, and what we see here is just a small fraction of these translations. Now the gold standard of the translations were from Italy. And here we see a series of magnificent volumes published in Italy in the 1970s, whereby they collected every Garth story from its there's the main artist, Stephen Dowling. And there you see the first 3 Garth stories from its very beginning. It's a 1943 origin story of Garth. And if you look there on those 2 panels, you see that in this Australian reprint, that also reprinted the first story. Now this Australian edition, this comic book here, was a facsimile reprint of a book published by the Daily Mirror in 1946 called Garth, Man of Mystery, and this was the origin story. Unfortunately, the Daily Mirror book and the Australian reprint was abridged. There was missing strips, but all of the missing strips are in this Italian edition. Magnificent book. So it got all the first story, and then the next, the Garth story, Children of the Dawn. And they continued on chronologically into the 3rd adventure. Beautifully produced. And they continued on through the later 40s with all the other stories. This is the original, this is the real Garth by his originators. It was written by Don Freeman and illustrated by Stephen Dowling, with his young teenage assistant John Allard, who joined him from school at the age of 15 as his assistant. And what was more, all of these adventures continued on chronologically without a break. The story ended, and then the next story took place immediately. So these were all really one gigantic rolling series of adventures. And this was the high water mark of Garth, and this is also the high water mark of book production, foreign editions. There's a third volume, Olympic story of Garth, going back ancient Greece. Beautifully reproduced, not a single strip missing. A truly magnificent series of Italian hardcovers. Continued on chronologically. That was the famous story, Journey to Jason, which I've mentioned. In 1950, that's when Garth went into a distinctly science fiction streak. And that's when I started clipping them out every day. Absolute classic, real Garth stories. And this series of books continued, reprinting all of the strips, the original strips that had been done by Garth's originator, artist Stephen Dowling. And then the final Stephen Dowling stories were continued in this paperback book, which you see here. And they contain the final stories written by Garth's originator, Don Freeman. Okay. So, Italy was the high water mark of the foreign translations. Now, as an ardent fan of the original artists, Stephen Dowling and John Allard, and writer Don Freeman, and his successor Peter O'Donnell, I was dismayed when Frank Bellamy took over in mid-story in 1971. See that here. And this later British reprint edition. There was the point where Frank Bellamy took over. John Allard had been drawing him. He was the successor to Steve Dowling, but after a few years, he was abruptly terminated in mid-story, and Frank Bellamy took over. And then Frank Bellamy continued for the next few years. Now, and at that time, I was dismayed when Frank Bellamy took over in mid-story, because I was remembering how Dan Day had been absolutely ruined when Bellamy took over that strip. Whilst Bellamy was a stylish and brilliant artist, a world-acclaimed artist in his own right, I felt that he was just totally unsuited to Garth. And sure enough, the storylines changed to accommodate his realistic style, changing from the whimsical fantasy and real science fiction backgrounds to earthbound contemporary gangster thrillers and James Bond imitations. You can see from the story, it's presenting Garth as a sort of poor man's James Bond. There's a Bond, typical Bond girl. Brilliantly drawn by Bellamy, but it's just not Garth stories. It's imitation James Bond. I wasn't happy about it, and nor were quite a few of Garth's followers. Now, Peter O'Donnell, the previous Garth writer, had carefully constructed Garth's lady love, Astra, and an entire Astra mythos and background was created. But under the Bellamy era, Astra became an overused travesty of her original self. We can see here. We were even asked to believe, if you look at the bottom 3 strips there, we were asked to believe that Astra now ranges over the entire universe. It's just based in interstellar space, spying on Garth on Earth and plucking him across thousands of light years to the 4 corners of the galaxy, using a mental power. It was too much. It was an utter absurdity. And Garth was rapidly going down the toilet. But then, following Bellamy's unfortunate early death in 1976, Martin Asbury took over as artist. And whilst at the beginning he was editorially instructed to imitate Bellamy's style, the stories continued to get worse. Gradually, however, Asbury was allowed to use his own distinctive, flowing and looser style. We'll see there. Oops. Just look at that style. Martin Asbury, allowed to use his own style, was an absolute master of a storyboarding technique, for which he was hired by major film studios. And with his now brilliant artwork, the strip improved immensely. Writer Jim Edgar reintroduced genuine science fiction and fantasy elements, and I was again following and collecting Garth with the greatest enjoyment. That is until 1988, when a story called Body Swap appeared. See the opening page there. Now, Body Swap completely violated Garth's canon by having him be seen sparring with Frank Bruno, the famous boxer. And declaring that he never boxed professionally. I was moved to write a letter to the Daily Mirror addressed to the strips editor. In it, I deplored this flagrant inaccuracy because in a 1949 Freeman and Dowling Allard story called The Glove Game, Garth had not only turned professional boxer, but had actually been crowned British heavyweight champion before retiring. I also deplored the fact that Garth's great friend Professor Lumiere had first been misnamed by writer Peter O'Donnell as Bertrand Lumiere in 1967, when his original 1944 given Christian name had been Jules, or Jules as the French would say. And now James Edgar, as we see in the bottom panel there, James Edgar had rechristened him as Henry Lumiere. I suggested how the stories of my favourite strip cartoon might be improved by its current writers and editor paying more attention to the precepts laid down in the heyday of Dowling and Allard, when the stories had been written by Don Freeman. Now, I had no idea then who the strip's editor was, but he turned out to be none other than John Allard himself. Allard replied with a very gracious letter, candidly admitting he'd simply forgotten all about Garth's earlier boxing story and promising to be more vigilant going forward. Then, in late July 1992, I was moved to writer Allard again, this time at even greater length. After criticising the failings, as I perceived them, of some recent Garth stories, although counterbalanced by praising others, I drew attention to the fact that 1993 would see the 50th anniversary of Garth's creation. I advocated that the Mirror should initiate the publication of a special volume celebrating 50 years of Garth and outlining in some detail how the book could discuss Garth's creation in 1943 and examine his development across 50 years, looking at all his tropes. I also advocated selected complete reprints of some of the best stories by his artists, Steve Dowling, John Allard, Frank Bellamy and Martin Asbury. There would be biographical details of all the creators. In particular, I emphasised that I myself had a complete cuttings collection of all the stories to date that I could make available for copying and could either write the introductory text or act as a consultant to someone else. On the 24th of August, Allard wrote thanking me for my letter and declared in part, "I am lost in admiration at your knowledge of this strip. I've worked on it with short breaks ever since it was started. I got the job of Steve Dowling's assistant when I was 15, which means I'll be retiring next year at the age of 65. The great majority of your comments I go along with. As cartoons crossword editor, I bear responsibility for the sort of stories of recent years. But the big problem has been finding a successor to Jim Edgar. He agreed my suggestion of a 50th anniversary book had merit and had his full support. He was therefore passing a copy of my letter to the Jaffa newspaper agency, which held the exploitation rights of the Daily Mirror strip cartoons. I quickly replied, expressing my appreciation of his latter action and responding to his other points about his difficulties in securing suitable stories. I outlined my own belief that what was needed was, quote, for the stories to be written by someone who really understands and knows science fiction history inside out. There are hundreds of science fiction ideas that have never been exploited in Garth. Then, on the 1st of September, I was pleased to receive a further letter from Allard. We see his letter there. And in which he enclosed a copy of a letter from Jaffa, the Mirror's exploitation rights firm. You see that, you can read their letter. And now Jaffa stated that they were following up on my idea for an anniversary book. And there we see the two letters. Alas, in the event, Jaffa would not be successful in finding an interested publisher. So my 50th anniversary book proposal never did eventuate. I did, however, contribute to this special fanzine which was published to celebrate the 50th anniversary. And I contributed an article that would have appeared in the Mirror book, but I gave it here to this issue of the fanzine. And it was a complete survey of all 50 years of the best Garth stories, analysed, the artwork discussed. That was Bellamy's best story, although I wasn't criticising Bellamy, I was criticising the stories that Bellamy illustrated. And that was one of his best ones. And then had a complete, if you look sideways on, checklist of all of the stories across 50 years. That was a cartoon by John Allard. So there was an anniversary tribute, but it was just a limited edition fanzine. But more significantly, if we look again at John Allard's letter, What was more significant was that John Allard actually invited me to try writing a Garth story myself. The fantastic array of past stories by superb writers made his proposal extremely daunting, but they were also inspirational. I had a complete collection of them, which I'd read and reread, and so had a profound understanding of the character of Garth. And I also had a complete collection of the works of John Russell Fearn. Now, what if I was to combine my two enthusiasms? Now, swiftly, I conceived a story called Twin Souls, a new Garth story entirely of my own devising, but it incorporated little snippets and plot elements and ideas from a wide variety of disparate Fearn science fiction stories, which included The Golden Amazon Returns from Fantastic Adventures, 1941. Bear with me, turn that story up. I took some plot elements from that story. And also incorporated elements from the two Vargo Stanton novels, you see there, 2,000 Years On and Catechism. Plot elements from those three stories was sort of woven into the new Garth story, which you'll see there. Now, I drew on my own experience in writing Fearn-inspired comic strips for Ron Turner, as have been shown in recent videos. I wrote a scenario in which I also detailed how I envisaged the actual picture scene in each panel, storyboard style. John Allard liked the story, but in accepting it, he explained that such detailed storyboarding was not in fact necessary, and that some verbiage and details would need to be trimmed and cut out. So he very kindly rewrote the story himself in the manner that a daily strip and a general public, rather than science fiction buffs, required. There we see an interesting document. That was John Allard's guide sheet, which he sent to artist Martin Asbury when he sent him my script. That was how John Allard, as the editor, how he envisaged the story being told and how the various characters looked. So that was interesting. Now then, let's have a look at the story, which was drawn by Martin Asbury. Now, in Twin Souls, Garth experiences vivid dreams of a planet dying from global warming. And Professor Lumiere, you see towards the bottom of the page there, Garth tells Lumiere about his dreams on this planet dying from global warming. And Lumiere deduces that he's telepathically linked to Krax, his cosmic twin, who is a ruler on a distant planet called Lyra. Lumiere has a gadget in which he transposes Garth's mind with that of Krax. And Krax had been placed in suspended animation on his own planet, and whilst he sleeps, Garth takes over his mind. Now, whilst Krax has been sleeping, his shadow leader, Nazrin, has forced the population into building spaceships to migrate into space, unaware that they are sabotaged or explode. And as the plot develops there, we we quickly learn that an insectile alien race are focusing the sun's heat onto Lyra to heat it up. They're focusing the sun's rays through vast lenses in a tunnel cut through the planet's moon to force the exodus into space. Now Garth and Krax's girlfriend follow Nazran to the moon, where Nazran is revealed to be an alien who's only been wearing Nazran's body, Nazran's dead body. Garth and Elvia manage to fight the insects and escape. There's the lens beaming the sun's rays onto Lyra to heat the planet up with global warming. Garth and Elvia manage to escape in a spaceship, and they succeed in smashing all the lenses in the moon and causing it to explode to save Elvia's home planet. Now Garth is still in the body of Krax, but Krax reclaims his body. Krax is back on Earth with Lumiere, but he gets him to quickly put him back in his own body, just as Garth is about to make love to his girlfriend. So he gets back there. Quite a humorous touch. And Elvia is unaware of the switch, of course. Now, after the story had been published, Allard arranged to meet me shortly thereafter, making an overnight stay on Tyneside on his journey to Scotland for a holiday. He confided to me that he was urgently looking for a reliable writer for his favourite strip before his own impending retirement. All the Daily Mirror editors were obliged to retire at age 65. Time was of the essence. If I couldn't respond quickly, he'd be obliged to look for writers elsewhere. So I promised him I'd do my best to quickly supply synopses for future stories. What happened then will be discussed in my next video.